In the Church of Scientology, they say that whenever two people are in dispute and they are unable to come to agreement or resolution, you must always look for the hidden hand. There's another entity involved. If the two are sincerely striving or trying for resolution and it can't come about, then there's some other entity, there's some other person involved. You know, like you could have a relationship breaking down or whatever, and the two people come together to try to resolve it. But what they don't know is that the man already has another woman in his life. He's already looking beyond her, or vice versa. She's already looking beyond him. Well, that's unresolvable. So I just want us to appreciate, beloved, that many of the arguments that we have in the black community, whether it's an argument about Malcolm X and who killed Malcolm X, and you got some of us in the black community, we want to implode on one another. You all kill. Shut up. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. You're playing right into the playbook, the modus operandi of the enemy with these types of arguments. We've been so set up, beloved. And I hate to see us falling for it. Hook, line, and sinker. I just want to quote you a scripture from the book of Psalms 23 verse 4. It says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And I have to say, you know, beloved, in dealing with the things that we have to deal with today, they're not lightweight things. And our enemy is a natural born killer. His system is based on blood. His inception was based on blood shedding. So the angels, when Allah said, "I'm going to place a ruler in the earth," they said, we extol, you know, your holiness, and we give you the praise, but what will you place in the earth if not that which will cause mischief and the shedding of blood? That's from the very inception of them, beloved. The angels knew what was about to go down. And God knew what was about to go down, but he said, "I know what you know not." In other words, by the end of the process, it will work in your favor. It will be my will to see the outcome. But we got to go through this process of mischief and bloodshedding. So, not all of us are going to make it in terms of getting through the mischief and the bloodshed. Some of us may have to lose our life. That's how it works. What kind of a follower are we going to be? What kind of a follower are we? Well, I want to be the type of follower who is unafraid to lose his life. That's the kind of follower I want to be. I'm asking you to consider, what kind of a follower are you going to be? And I'm not just talking to those of us who are registered members of the Nation of Islam London study group. I'm talking to the black community globally. What kind of a follower are you? Some of us don't even want to follow. Did you know that before you can lead, you have to learn to follow? See, because you can't be no leader. How are you going to lead? What are you going to lead? What is going to be the parameters of your leadership? What discipline are you following that others are going to look to you as a leader if you were so indisciplined in the inception that you couldn't follow the lead?
Think about it. Think about it.
Some of us just want to be leaders. Pathetic. It can't be done, beloved. To be a leader, you got to learn to follow. The question is, what are you going to follow? 1885, that carve up, that scramble for Africa began in what was then called the Berlin Conference. Robert Mugabe was educated at Kutuma College and the University of Fort Hare, and I think he also received degrees from the University of London, University of South Africa, and the University of London International. He actually achieved some degrees. I think he got 3 degrees whilst he was incarcerated in prison in the former so-called Rhodesia. Everybody all right?
Yes, sir.
Before he became a revolutionary, he worked as a school teacher. Robert Mugabe we're talking about. He worked as a school teacher in southern Rhodesia, northern Rhodesia, and also in Ghana. Robert Mugabe hated with a passion the fact of British colonization of his homeland. He was one of these black people who just didn't think it was right that these white Europeans should be so dominant in Africa, but in particular in his homeland. This brutal white minority, primarily from Western Europe, and over a period of years usurped, corrupted, and then using both stealth and force. It wasn't one way or another. They employed a lot of different agencies, and remember that you're dealing with the father of tricks and lies. This is how they ultimately forced their way into Africa and moved into occupation and power in the land. Throughout the time of white minority rule, laws were written and enacted that made it almost impossible or illegal for anything like land redistribution or land reform to take place then or in the future. The white man writes laws to make it now almost impossible for you to turn around what he has done illegally. According to the history, much of what Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party did during the build-up to and during the Second World War was legal. Remember when our brother Bernie Grant posed the question in Parliament, African reparations to Tony Blair, and Tony Blair said at the time of our enslavement it was not illegal.
That's what he said. It wasn't illegal.
Understand what you're dealing with here. This is a real satanic mind. Statutes and provisions like willing seller, willing buyer. These are the things that they put in statutes and law. Willing seller, willing buyer were put in place to frustrate the morality of righting the historical wrong, so that if the white man did not agree to sell his stolen land at today's market price, there was no black person, and there was no black person willing to pay that market price, or the black government was not willing to compensate the white farmer to the tune of that market price, then nothing could be done legally to change the situation. This is a devil. This is a demon. who will wrap you up in legalese in order to frustrate justice. Right from the outset of this talk, beloved family, I want to deal with Robert Mugabe being a so-called communist and how this relates or fits into the scheme of things, and how the adoption of one white man's system over another is justified in revolutionary terms. Because whether it's capitalism or communism, they're both coming from the white man. So why would Robert Mugabe embrace Marxism and Leninism to communists? Why? Robert Mugabe's political leaning, like so many other African revolutionaries, you remember all of those people we talked about before? Like so many other revolutionary leaders who were born into similar oppressive situations such as apartheid, colonization, and enslavement, came about mostly as a result of expediency. Expediency. More so than favored or preferred choice. Expediency, it's what we just need to do. It's expedient. We've got to deal with this, even though that's not necessarily the best option or our real choice. As a medium of expediency, we got to embrace this. This is why I believe, this is my belief, I believe the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, or even better, the idea of socialism, because that's what essentially a lot of our revolutionary brothers and sisters in the 50s and the 60s, that's what they embraced. This is why I believe that idea of socialism becomes the political, economic, and social model and choice that is the closest resemblance to the original way of life of African people. They're trying to find an alternative to this capitalist apartheid system that has been imposed. What's the closest model to the traditional way of life of collective work and responsibility of Africans? It's called socialism. In the Holy Quran, man is referred to in Arabic as insan, which means a social being. Our nature is social. When we don't get on with other human beings and are able to properly interact with other human beings, it's called anti-social. That's just not our nature. I've been to Africa a few times, and I went and I met a lot of poor people in poor villages. But I'm telling you, beloved, when you go into the village, the first thing they want to do, they're looking around to sacrifice that last chicken to give you a meal, sacrifice that goat to give you a meal. Whatever they got, they want to share. This is the principle that those brothers like Robert Mugabe were seeking, to put something in place that was better than the capitalist dog-eat-dog system of the white oppressor. And even though Marxism and Leninism was coming from another white man, those white people in Russia were opposed to the capitalist West. Socialism is also in theory and in geopolitical practice the opposite to the enslaving, colonial, apartheid and class-driven capitalist system that these revolutionary brothers and sisters were fighting against. Moscow and the white Russians were very happy to offer Marxism and Leninist philosophy in Kalashnikovs. See, when you think about the guerrilla fighters in Africa, where'd they get those Kalashnikovs from? They didn't come from Britain or America. They came from Russia or China, who were so-called communist. So it was the enemy of yours is my friend. Understand that See, because some of us, we will criticize those warriors for, oh, but yeah, but he was a communist. Shut up. They were using expediency because of a circumstance not of their making that they found themselves in. And the only way to extricate themselves from that situation was to align with another system that was in opposition to the system that was oppressing them. And that's why sometimes when I listen to some of our people who are so black that we want to alienate Chinese, we want to alienate Asians, we want to alienate everybody. Everybody is the enemy. And we got no allies. And we think that we're going to be able to get through with no allies. No, beloved. Not in reality. In a theoretical craziness, yes. But in reality, you need allies. You need to be able to work with people who you don't necessarily agree 100% with their philosophy. But if you can find elements within what they are dealing with that you can use to your benefit, that's intelligence. For the critics, oh, the Nation of Islam, look, they with the Church of Scientology. Shut up. You don't know nothing about strategy. Oh, the Nation of Islam, they've aligned themselves with the KKK. Well, the KKK, they believe in separation. So do we. We don't want nobody hoodwinking us or hoodwinking our people into some crazy notion that we're all just going to embrace and get along when we've been trying that for 500 years. And all it's gotten us is right at the bottom of the quagmire and in hell, while other people live in high-rise luxury. We ain't going out like that. We will use any tool that works. And in the Church of Scientology, they got a tool called Dianetics. And that tool is the modern science of the mind, designed to undo damage that has been done to black people and other people that lives and stays with them and become impediments to their growth and development. And that tool, we can employ it to remove some of those impediments so that that person becomes clear and concise in their move towards greater activity, growth, and development. All praise is due to Allah. We're not Scientologists. But then what does Scientology mean? Science, the study of science. You think we're afraid of studying science? You think that God is a spook? No, God is a super scientist. So we embrace science. Now, beloved family, we were given Kalashnikovs by the White Russians in order for us to effect our revolution and take ourselves out from under the yoke of Western imperialist and capitalist regimes, whether in Cuba, other parts of South America, or Africa. Hence, Fidel Castro. See, this is where it all comes from. There was alliances being struck in order for liberation movements to become more effective in terms of revolution. Because what you need to appreciate, what we all need to appreciate, is it's not like we didn't try alternatives, beloved. So-called peaceful alternatives. Believe me, we tried. But the enemy, he wasn't interested in making any adjustment to his evil treatment of original black people. And so at a certain point in time, that revolutionary process had to kick in. Robert Mugabe became a black nationalist who protested and agitated for change. The people of Zimbabwe, including Robert Mugabe, had for years tried non-violent methods to overturn the apartheid regime that ran Rhodesia, but to no avail. This is years of struggle. Britain and the rest of the Western world ignored the desperate plight of the Zimbabwean people. They didn't give a damn. Africans crying out on the oppression, and Britain was just waxing rich from the money that was coming from the apartheid regime. Whether in so-called Rhodesia or South Africa, it was the same situation. Margaret Thatcher at one stage said, we can't impose sanctions on these regimes because it would hurt the Africans. It's at that time you want to get your baseball bat out. Her husband was one of the biggest single investors in apartheid South Africa. Dennis Thatcher. Robert Mugabe and other Africans called for an independent state that would be led and represented by the black majority. That's what they wanted. You know, imagine you're living in a place where 8 of the people are black, 2 of the people are white, and the 2 people rule the 8. Does that make any sense? No, beloved. And so all the Africans were calling for was black majority rule. As a result of his call for black majority rule, he was falsely accused of sedition, and he was imprisoned without trial from 1964 to 1974. He served approximately 11 years in prison without even a proper trial. Bearing in mind what we said before, these corrupt, twisted tricks called legalese or law that they put in place to frustrate any opportunity for real change to take place within that system. On release, he became exiled in Mozambique, and others were exiled in Zambia. They had to literally leave because they were constantly under threat of more detention and possibly even death, because that Rhodesian army was an absolute genocidal white supremacist hit squad, and they killed black people like it was going out of fashion. He became the leader of ZANU and was instrumental in the launch of a bush war against the white racist Rhodesian government led by Ian Smith. Ian Smith infamously said at the time, listen to what Ian Smith said. He said, "I don't believe in black majority rule." This is the white man.
I don't believe in black majority rule ever in Rhodesia, not in 1,000 years. I repeat, I believe in black and whites working together. If one day it's white and the next day it is black, I believe we will have failed, and I think it will be a disaster for Rhodesia.
He said, not in 1,000 years. This is how long Ian Smith envisioned white people remaining in control in that region. Not in 1,000 years would black majority rule take place. And I want you to understand, beloved, because those sentiments exist right now in white people and in some of our misguided, miseducated black people, in that when we talk about reparations, not in 1,000 years. When we talk about a separate nation of our own, not in 1,000 years. When we talk about black people coming to power, not in 1,000 years. Understand? These are the kind of odds that our warriors have always faced. What did they say to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad? They laughed at him. They said, "Oh, so you're the one who's going to reform black people." He said, the white man said to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that would be like trying to put trousers on an elephant. Honorable Elijah Muhammad's reply, well, guess what? I've already got one leg of the elephant in. Praise be to Allah. That's called supreme optimism. Why supreme optimism? Because supreme is God. Our faith is in God. Our faith is not in no Kalashnikov. Our faith is in the supreme. Ian Smith went on after he said, not in 1,000 years, he went on to say, it will be a disaster for Zimbabwe, for black people to rule. Now understand, that wasn't just an idle statement. When he said it would be a disaster for Zimbabwe, he meant it because, see, whenever they have to give up power, they work to create a disaster. This is the nature of the white man. Understand that the white man's mentality is, if I can't be the ruler, no one can be the ruler. I would rather destroy the whole thing than to allow you. Understand the mentality that you're dealing with. For those of us who are quick to turn around and criticize the black man or black woman who has now taken power, not understanding the forces that, you know, we were talking to the Zimbabwean government at a pretty high level at one stage and on a fairly regular basis. And I won't name the brother who was in the government, but I was in the embassy, Zimbabwean embassy, talking with him. And I explained to him, I said, brother, the way the white man works is that he will release your leg with his right hand while taking hold of your other leg with his left hand. That's right. And the brother laughed. And he literally almost went on the carpet in the embassy with laughter. He said, that is such a good analogy. I said, but brother, he will never let go. And he got it. He understood. He don't let go. It's not within his nature to let go. He hasn't let go of Hong Kong. What you see going on in Hong Kong today, there is a hidden hand. And it's not even hidden. He is in there, fermenting against Chinese rule. This is the nature of the devil. Look, beloved family, Ian Smith and many other whites at the time, they were referring to black Zimbabweans as, quote, black barbarian savages. This is the way they spoke about black people, the whites who were in control in Rhodesia. Robert Mugabe and the guerrilla fighters were labeled terrorists by the Western world media. As a result of the war for liberation, millions of Zimbabweans were displaced. Because again, see, when we think about these historical things, it's like in very simplistic terms. But the reality on the ground, like the reality of people trying to come across the Atlantic and trying to come across the, what do they call it, the sea around Britain? The North Sea, coming across the channel in these little boats today. Well, that was happening in Zimbabwe at that time, beloved, where hundreds of thousands of Zimbabweans were now forced to run away from their country, forced into exile, forced into becoming refugees from their own land, forced into conditions that were literally like starvation. Forced, beloved, into orphanage, becoming orphans. Forced, beloved, into becoming, widows because they'd lost their husbands killed by the Rhodesian Air Force and the Rhodesian Army, because these were men who were fighting, forced to bury their children who were hit in bombing raids by the Rhodesian military air force. This is the reality of what was going on in those days. From the very earliest days of Robert Mugabe's emerging as the revolutionary leader, the British media were calling him a black Hitler. I want you to hear what they were calling him. This is in the early days of him now emerging after going into exile in Mozambique and others into Zambia. They were calling him, Mugabe, a black Hitler. Why would you compare this black revolutionary with the worst of your white people? A genocidal maniac who you say is responsible for putting 6 million people into gas chambers. Where is Mugabe's record of doing anything like that? So understand how the die is cast from the very beginning when you hear the language. So when you hear them calling him these things later on, it's nothing new. They already made up their minds from the very beginning. When white Rhodesians were calling black people maniacal savages. From the beginning, when they were just trying to oppose a system of injustice. ZANU-PF became the ruling party that formed the new government. However, much remained the same. Some of the same white racist government officials who were under Ian Smith remained and became advisors to Robert Mugabe. The government was called a government of national reconciliation. Only us! Only us! Only us! According to his own words, even Robert Mugabe believed that his former enemies had transformed into his allies. The armed struggle was not allowed to reach its logical conclusion with the complete overthrow and destruction of the apartheid system and its actors, but instead it was agreed that all sides would negotiate a political solution at Lancaster House in London. Whenever you're about to beat the white man, he will say, let's talk. Understand how he works. Whenever he knows that he's about to lose, he will say, let's negotiate. But negotiation is not to go in your favor. Negotiation is yet another trick. It's just yet another one of his cards. Our beloved sister, Sister Ava Muhammad said, we lost our killer instinct. Knocking down our enemy, but allowing him to get up to fight us another day. No, beloved. When you knock down your enemy, you kill him. Now, I want you to hear what I'm saying to you. I'm going to say it again, those of you who are queasy. When you knock the enemy down, he must be killed, never to rise again. That's why he's called an enemy. That's why he was slaughtering and murdering you. But when you allow him to get up, and you think, oh, now you're going to deal with him, now we're going to negotiate the peace. You know, the armed struggle was not allowed to reach its logical conclusion, beloved brothers and sisters. Instead, they came to Lancaster House in London. Robert Mugabe came under pressure from other less radical so-called frontline state leaders at the time to compromise with the Smith regime and the British, and he reluctantly took part in the peace negotiations that eventually became the Lancaster House Agreement. Robert Mugabe he wanted to pursue the war and finish it the proper way. That would have been the way to do it. But he was persuaded by these other leaders in the region who were saying, look, we need to end the fighting because it's too damaging to our economies. Because not only was Zimbabwe suffering as a result of the carnage and the war that was going on, but other so-called frontline states in that South African region, what they call the SADC region, they were feeling the effects of that which was going on in Zimbabwe. And in order for them to, and they're not just pressuring Robert Mugabe from their own perspective, they're getting pressure from Westminster, they're getting pressure from Washington, they're getting pressure from all of these other white entities saying you need to put pressure on your black brother to effect peace. This is how it works. This is how it worked then, this is how it works today at the United Nations, where backroom deals are done and governments are forced to compromise on their integrity in order to back up that which is an alliance between devils. The Lancaster House Agreement said in essence that there would be a government of national unity in Zimbabwe and that thereafter would follow a process of land redistribution, and that the British government would pay compensation to those white farmers who would lose land. Would you like me to say that again? The agreement was that the British government would pay compensation to those white farmers who ultimately would lose land as a result of land redistribution. That was the agreement. The agreement was reached with the government of Margaret Thatcher. You remember her? The agreement was then reneged on over the next 20 years. Nothing happened. 20 years. We've made an agreement. Land reform. We've just been fighting a guerrilla war for black people to come back now and get back some land and get some kind of parity in their homeland. 20 years. 20 years. Many government ministers and officials in ZANU-PF, ZAPU, I'll explain later who they are. ZAPU, which was Joshua Nkomo's group that were in alliance with Robert Mugabe, and they fought the guerrilla campaign to bring about this situation. There were many in ZANU-PF and ZAPU and other international observers, the general public and other smaller parties, spoke out against the slowdown of the revolutionary process of change and the lack of land reform that so many people had sacrificed their lives in war, but to no avail, and nothing changed. There was a lot of outcry. People were saying, well, what's going on? But this went on for 20 years. There was no land reform, beloved brothers and sisters. Things finally came to a head under the Labour government of Tony Blair and Claire Short, who was the former Secretary of State for International Development of the United Kingdom. According to the Guardian newspaper, which stated at the time, Claire Short said, and I quote, she informed the Zimbabwean government in 1997 that the election of a Labour government without links to former colonial interest. This is Claire Short talking. That the election of a Labour government without links to former colonial interest meant Britain no longer had special responsibility to meet the cost of land purchases. But where did she get this idea that there was no links? See, the government, whether it's Conservative or Labour, beloved, it never changes. They all carry out the same anti-black policies which has been in existence for hundreds of years. But here you got Claire Short. I think at the time she claimed Irish ancestry and was invoking this thing that, well, we as Irish people, we suffered the potato famine. So we're in the same boat as these black people. So how are you demanding any kind of reparation or compensation from us? And so Blair's government with Claire Short continued the reneging. What the Lancaster House Agreement did do was to end the war and save the skin of white supremacy. That's what Lancaster House was designed to do, to stop the progress of the revolution. Remember what revolution is. This is a revolution. A complete change. And they didn't want a complete change. So that agreement was to stop and to bring about the 1980 general election in which Robert Mugabe led ZANU-PF to victory. But what did the Honourable Minister Louis Farrakhan say about political change without economic change? Can anybody remember? I can't remember the exact wording. But he said it's symbol without substance. Political change without economic change is symbol, a flag going up. It's symbol, but there is no substance. And this is the game that the devil plays in these so-called independent ceremonies that we've all witnessed. 1962, Jamaica became independent. But who remains the head of state?
Governor General.
The Governor General acting on behalf of the Queen of England. There is no independence, beloved family. In the beginning, Robert Mugabe was elected Prime Minister of Zimbabwe. He and his family moved into the old home of the former white ruler Ian Smith. Have you watched George Orwell's Animal Farm? We need to study. See, because when the pigs overthrew the farmer and took over the farm, the pigs moved into the former farmhouse of the farmer. And before you know it, the pigs stopped walking on 4 legs and started standing on 2 legs and behaving much like the farmer used to. The pigs started sleeping in the farmer's bed and started eating at the table of the farmer. See, real revolution, brothers and sisters, I think it was Brother Malcolm X who said, in answer to a question, I think it was, he said, don't talk to me about revolution. He said, because in a revolution, you may have to kill your own brother. You may have to kill your own sister. You may have to kill your own mother. You may have to kill some of your own people. Because revolution, beloved, a real revolution, it means complete change. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't understand that you can't necessarily have a revolution where you move into the former office of the former colonial master. Let's go a little bit deeper. As Prime Minister of the newly renamed Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's administration expanded healthcare and education to include the black majority population who had previously been left out of such normal public amenities. Education, healthcare, those things weren't set up in Rhodesia for black people. We had to find a way to survive. But those things were for whites. Whites had good schools, good healthcare. These were some of the things that Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF tried to change when he became the Prime Minister. At this time, many whites were fleeing the country because of their fear of a black majority backlash. As soon as that election was won, they started running, beloved. Enough of them fled. According to the reports at the time, the 3 major concerns for whites at the time of the election was the fear of rapid integration or equal opportunities that in their minds would cause a decline in standards of health, education, and security. This was their concerns. Our health care is going to go down. Our education is going to go down because these black savages are going to be allowed maybe to come and sit in the same classroom or to get the same health care, or security is going to go down because the black savages are now going to be running the house, and therefore our security is going to be undermined. You know, with people like that, beloved, you do realize that they need to actually get the hell out of the people's country.
Yes, sir.
You see that superior mentality? And so those essential provisions were only ever for Caucasians. But the Caucasians need not have worried. They didn't have nothing to worry about, beloved, because nothing changed. Everything and everyone continued as before, with only slight little token tweaks here and there by ZANU-PF government. That's real. You know, they were scared to death. What are they going to do? But ZANU-PF basically kept everything as it was. The government of Robert Mugabe decided to continue following the same capitalist monetary policies with its inbuilt inequalities, rather than to adopt or create a more socialist, Africanized model that would be more equitable to the masses of the people. That's what Mugabe did. You know, for those, oh, he was such a terrible, wicked man. No, beloved. This is important, why we must learn and study history for ourselves. Because if we take the narrative of our enemy, the liar, from the beginning, we will always misunderstand and go off on a tangent that will cause us to be part of that problem that they have fashioned for us. Abusive behavior of the white bosses against black workers continued unabated. Do you understand that the same thing is happening in South Africa today? Do you understand that black people today in South Africa, over 20 years after Mandela, black people still suffering racism at the hands of white people who are controlling the levers of power? And our people are still, many of them, acting like beggars, trying to get equal and fair treatment within South Africa. This is what happened in Zimbabwe, beloved. Same thing. And, you know, ZANU-PF, they tried to make a few interventions here and there, but generally because all of the systems remained in place, they were effectively powerless, and they were symbols without substance. The masses of the workers on the white commercial farms were black Zimbabweans who, from the beginning of whites stealing the land away from the blacks by force, have been employed and paid little more than what amounts to slave labor or under subsistence pay. See the way people complaining today in this country about low pay? And why Boris Johnson is now talking about a minimum, or the living wage going up to £10 or something like that, and the Labour Party talking about the same thing now, because there's an election brewing. Yes, so now they've got to start promising the people that, oh, we're gonna give you a little bit more. Yeah. But the reality is that so many people in this country are paid at subsistence level. They've just got just enough to keep surviving. But no way to be able to save, or no way to be able to take a decent holiday, or no way to be able to afford the things that their children really want or need. Well, that's here. Imagine Africa. And the way in which they treating our people there. And in those days, in the early 80s in Zimbabwe, it was diabolical, beloved. Diabolical. It was satanic. The kind of pay that our people, the masses of our people working primarily for white people in that system, were receiving. The British mass media hyped up any and every incident concerning a white man or white woman who suffered the least bit of privation as a result of black Zimbabweans wanting to come up to equality and to exercise some modicum of their God-given freedoms. any incident, because there were some incidents, any incident that happened where any white person suffered any kind of little privation or something like that, the mass media went crazy during that time, highlighting the suffering, the poor suffering of these poor whites who are now at the mercy of this black government. Robert Mugabe was conflicted between the Marxist-Leninist philosophy of collective ownership and equal distribution of resources and wealth, which he felt and knew was more compatible with traditional African principles and practices, but at the same time he was conflicted by his Roman, Catholic and Christian indoctrination, which on the one hand talked about loving those who despitefully use you, and promotes the idea of individualism or the right of the individual above the collective. This is what white supremacy, in the guise of Christianity, professes. He attempted to strike a happy medium between this rock of socialism and this hard place of capitalism, with the end result in mind of trying to please everyone and ending up pleasing no one. We're talking about Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and it's very obvious and clear to me that I'm not going to finish this week, but inshallah, if Allah spares our life, then we'll continue with it next week. But in reality, beloved family, at this time, Robert Mugabe became the #1 appeaser of whites in his attempts to reassure them that their lifestyle of privilege and power would not be disturbed. Robert Mugabe, he became the #1 appeaser of them to make them comfortable. Relax, it's cool. Despite the reality of Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF maintaining the status quo, many thousands of whites, in fear of what they thought was about to happen, fled Zimbabwe before and after the election. To many of the whites who remained, Robert Mugabe became the great white hope. This is how they viewed him. This man was taking care of business. And they loved him. I want you to hear me. See, you've got to go and study the history. Robert Mugabe's lack of action towards real democratic change or land reform for the benefit of the masses of black Zimbabweans was so appreciated by Britain that he was given an honorary knighthood by the Queen in 1994. A Knight of the Realm. Well, why are you doing that? Because here's a black man, a revolutionary, who has fought to change the condition of his people, but now that he's in power, he is working according to your dictates and you're happy. There were a number of sporadic incidents of violence by some of the former freedom fighters against white people and their symbols of power, ownership and privilege. But from the beginning, the way these things were reported locally and internationally was devoid of any link between the past white systems of injustice and portrayed as just mindless violence for no reason. This is how the media would report, when black people who are now disgruntled, they're unhappy. These are former freedom fighters who would just say, Wagwan! Some of them were Jamaicans. What's going on? Nothing's changing. And sometimes they would box a white man in the street. But then it was reported in the mass media like these are just some crazy black people. No connection, no link to the historic injustice which continued to this day. So, my God, despite Robert Mugabe's so-called Marxist leanings, very little of a visible socialist system was implemented, but instead much of the economic policies of the former system was left in place. Robert Mugabe and the freedom fighters' revolutionary aim was a one-party state. That's what they were fighting for. They wanted to create a state, a one-party system whereby they could really make real reforms once they got rid of the apartheid regime in Zimbabwe. But instead, they were co-opted into accepting the Westminster model or so-called multi-party system of government. The Parliament remained exactly the same, even to the now black Speaker of the House wearing the white wig, as is the British system. I mean, it's laughable when you see us, mimicking the white man. Robert Mugabe's initial call was for racial reconciliation. That's what he was calling for. Hence the fact that Ian Smith and many of his generals, who were in reality war criminals, and genocidal white supremacists, instead of being tried and punished, they were reprieved. They were left and, given carte blanche to just continue. At the same time, certain elements within the white-dominated media and covert and overt political forces were working overtime to create schisms between the alliance of Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union, that's ZAPU. They were trying to create schisms between ZAPU and Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU. So, see, look, Mugabe is cooperating, but nevertheless, the media and certain elements, covert and overt, are working to create schisms between Nkrumah and Mugabe and Robert Mugabe. The vast majority of the more than 30,000 war veterans, these are the guerrilla fighters, refused to integrate into the new army alongside the former Rhodesian army. A lot of the brothers said, no, we ain't doing it.
Yes, sir.
And that was, a problem now for the government. Listen to this. They refused to integrate into the new army alongside the former Rhodesian army, and instead of being hailed as heroes of a successful revolution, they became an embarrassment to the new government of national unity. They became a national security problem and a threat to the so-called peace. See when your leaders can be co-opted?
Yes, sir.
And now you're a fighter, man, on behalf of your people. You've seen your colleagues die. You've seen children orphaned. You've seen women refugeed and all kinds of suffering. And now you're an embarrassment. Do you know that Winnie Mandela became an embarrassment?
Yes, sir. That's right, Nelson. Yes, sir. That's right.
She became an embarrassment to the ANC once they got into power. No, beloved, our people should never be an embarrassment. Our people should be embraced and given autonomy and the ability to exist within a system that we have built, just the same way you're trying to accommodate these white people.
That's right.
Why are you not accommodating those who fought and gave us the freedom? It's pathetic, beloved. It's really, really pathetic. And we got to look out for those kind of so-called leaders.
Yes,
because they ain't leaders, beloved. They're damn sellouts. Zanla, the military wing of ZANU, and ZIPRA, the military wing of ZAPU, were the two guerrilla forces who had formerly cooperated in the war of liberation against the Rhodesian army and air force, many of whom now found themselves without a place in power or government. They're like just out there. They actually had them living in these massive camps. ZAPU and ZANU had successfully worked and fought together against the Rhodesian apartheid system, but now that white supremacy was on the back foot and on the way out, the tactic of divide and rule to frustrate the complete victory of the revolution was being employed to the full. Working on them. Working on these two forces to get them to go to war against one another. The way in which the media will report things to us, they're banking on the fact that we're so simplistic in the way in which we look at things that we won't understand the devil that's in the detail and the complexities involved in a transition from one system to another. And the areas of gray between those two positions of black and white. Ain't no lightweight thing, beloved. And we mustn't ever allow anybody to so control the narrative that we have fed a story that we gobble up hook, line and sinker and not realize that there is an agenda in that narrative. And it's an agenda that's not good for us in coming to a proper understanding of what has happened. Some of the players involved in the soup mix of complex relations in Zimbabwe in 1980 to 1987. These are some of the players involved. Robert Mugabe's ZANU and ZANLA versus Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU and ZIPRA. Political and military wings. These are the players now. These are the things that you have to take into account when you wonder, well, why were things so difficult? Why didn't things work out? Why? This is because you're dealing with now these entities. These were the political and military wings. The former white Rhodesian leadership, including politicians, military personnel, security, and intelligence services. They're all involved. The international bankers. They're in there.
Always.
They're involved.
Always.
The hysterical and provocative, mostly white-led international mass media. This ain't no black media, beloved. This is the mass media, the scribes and the Pharisees writing about what's going on and feeding the public. The former racist Rhodesian police force. The commercial business sector, over 4,000 white farmers. Not to mention an extremely nervous white population. These are the forces. The South African apartheid government was involved. So here you got an apartheid regime just being overthrown, but South African apartheid regime is still intact. And they were former supporters of the white regime that's now collapsed. You think they're just folding their arms and just watching? Or are they involved? The South African security and intelligence services, the South African military, the British government, the British, Israeli and American intelligence services, all with operatives on the ground in Zimbabwe. I just want you to understand what these people are up against. I watched an interview with our brother, Robert Mugabe, on one occasion, and he admitted, how nervous he was in taking power after a guerrilla campaign that he led and basically taking over this system, and how it was unprecedented for them. They didn't have any real models to go by. How difficult that must be. I want you to, okay, so here we are, Nation of Islam London Study Group. We want to go into leadership. Are we ready? You got to think. It ain't an easy thing leading people, beloved. When you're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of people and running an economy and a system of governance, this is real. But then at the same time, when you got forces, covert and overt, doing nefarious things. So, as I close, beloved, these are the types of forces that were on the ground, operating in Zimbabwe and on an international level. Let me say this as I close. I love Robert Mugabe. Have you heard all the things I've said about him? Didn't he betray the revolution to some degree? Wasn't he appeasing white people? Wasn't he keeping the status quo? I love that man. I love that man. And that man is one of our heroes, and he's one of our warriors. But beloved family, if we think that our heroes and our warriors are going to be flawless, saintly, and, you know, I heard the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan say one time, one of the reasons why we don't walk on red carpets is because we haven't spilt the blood of hundreds and thousands and millions of human beings. But he said, you show me the leader in this world who hasn't been responsible. And that's the difference between this world and the world that Master Farad Muhammad has come to bring in. It's not an accident that we are unarmed and that we don't pick up the carnal weapons of the devil. There's a difference, beloved. But we have to understand that when you are fighting a genocidal regime like the ones that Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, Abdul Nasser, all of these leaders came up against, if you haven't got a Kalashnikov in your hand, the chances are you're not going to prevail. Those were the circumstances. And in those circumstances and in the soup mix of politics that were mostly orchestrated by the oppressive systems, things were bound to unfold in such a way that there would be great loss of life, tremendous tragedies, tremendous betrayals, and all manner of evil would unfold.